Greetings, Dr. Joseph Martin. Dr. Viktor Emil Frankl, a man that I met when I was in my teen years and early 20s, who changed my life and inspired me to be a psychologist and a psychotherapist. Of course, there were others, but he was the one that I met at that age in person many times when he spoke in Toronto to young people in Massey Hall. He gave a series of lectures there. Dr. Frankl was born to a Jewish family in Vienna, Austria in 1905, and he lived a long, healthy life until 1997. Now, interestingly enough, he was a very short man, but full of energy, and he had a brother and a sister. He studied philosophy, he studied many different things, obviously psychology. His interests were in depression and suicide, which was part of his PhD thesis as well. And he was a medical doctor and a psychiatrist and a neurologist who treated a lot of women, particularly who were suicidal. Now, during the years in Austria in the 1920s and into the early 1930s, before Hitler came to prominence in that area of the world, and of course we remember that Hitler himself was Austrian and perhaps partly Jewish as well, Dr. Viktor Frankl was very interested in the higher potential for people, especially young people and especially women, so that they could aim for some goals that were meaningful for them in their lives. So, for instance, he set up some free training for educators and psychologists and psychiatrists for all the high school students who were graduating from high school in Vienna and eventually in other parts of Austria, so that in their time when they got their report cards at the end of the year and maybe were feeling a little down at their marks, he would give free counseling through all the people he trained to all these high school students to motivate and inspire them to greater things and higher education in their own lives. He's well known for setting up programs in various hospitals in and around Vienna that treated over 30,000 women who were prone to suicide and depression. And as you'll remember, at that time in Europe, since about the 1860s to the 1930s, the treatment of depression and hysteria and neuroses in women was a big thing, because there were still a lot of women who did not have their voting rights or their economic rights or their full rights as human beings. So Dr. Frankl was always interested in supporting women in his life. He's known for many other programs he started that were very humanitarian and humanistic. In his studies, as he grew to study more from the early philosophy and neurology, more into psychiatry and psychology, he met Sigmund Freud and studied with him a bit, and also Dr. Alfred Adler, another Jewish psychiatrist at that time, and eventually became known for his work by Wilhelm Reich, and Reich invited him to Berlin to do some work with himself there. And now, in the late 1930s, obviously, Hitler was coming to prominence in that area of the world, and eventually Viktor Frankl's whole family was taken to Theresienstadt, to a camp where the Jews were interned. This is before it became a concentration camp, but it was a place where the Jews had to be set apart from the rest of society. There, because of his doctoring skills, he actually set about to do a lot of healing of the people who were suffering, obviously, a lot of stress and anxiety within that community, in the Jewish community there. And it was in that community, through a lot of stress, that his father died. Between 1942 and 1945, then, Viktor Frankl was in 4 different concentration camps, including Auschwitz and Dachau. And in those camps, his mother died, his wife Tilly died, and his brother died. His sister was the only one who escaped to Australia before they were all taken into the concentration camps. And although he was a short man and not very healthy, he was put into slave labor and digging rocks and sewing, carrying rocks, and making things for the Nazi concentration camp, Luftwaffe. Through this whole time, obviously, not many of us have had experiences living through and surviving physically the Holocaust or anything like the Holocaust, although we've had many Holocausts since in every continent of the world, but nothing like the one that we had in the 1940s in Germany and Poland. Nevertheless, it was in this time that Dr. Frankl found that one can survive in any extenuating circumstances if one can find meaning. If one can find a meaning to live, if one can find a reason or a why. As Nietzsche and Goethe both said, if one can find a why for living, you will survive. In this case, he had an epiphany, a metanoia, if you like, on one particular day when he was walking beside another man who said he was just thinking of his wife and wondering if his wife was still alive. Because, as you know, the men and the women were separated and put in separate camps, and there was no communication between them at all. And they were always wondering whether their wife or their family or their siblings were alive or not. And Viktor Frankl started to think about his family, and in particular his wife Tilly. And it was in this time, while they were walking, carrying stones and rocks from one pit to another in very damp, wet weather, on a particular day, that Viktor saw in his imagination the beautiful face of his very beloved wife, Tilly, whom he hadn't seen for a few years and wasn't even sure whether she was alive or not. And while he looked at this face inside his own imagination of his beloved, he came to some immediate realization that when there is love, and when you experience love and you can continue to feel love for a beloved, in this case his wife, then there is always hope and there is always meaning. And the highest and ultimate goal of human life is to be loved and to be in love. And this one experience, this existential experience from day to day to day, will not only let you survive, but thrive and give you the highest ultimate meaning, purpose, and sense of responsibility, happiness, and joy. It was this one thing, apart from his very highly active, intelligent, creative mind, intellectual mind, that kept him alive all those years. And on the day that the Americans liberated all the people from Auschwitz, it was the day that he started reciting again Kaddish, the prayer for the life of the soul after physical death. Viktor Frankl went on to not be accepted at all in Europe for all his ideas. He was a very pragmatic man who simplified all his theories in existential psychology, what eventually became called logotherapy, after the Greek word logos, which means meaning, and in other terms it can mean spirit, or the divine meaning or thought of the universe. But in his words, logos means meaning, and so meaning therapy, where the whole ultimate goal for any human being of any time or background is to find the meaning and live the meaning, and thereby thrive, be creative, and be loving. He was the inspiration for all the humanistic psychologists to come, including Abraham Maslow, whom I studied with, and many others, Carl Rogers, Virginia Satir, and on and on and on. And a lot of his work in marriage and family therapy and paradoxical interventions that he did in the 1920s became knowledgeable and used in family systems in the 1980s. Dr. Viktor Frankl was a very vivacious, active, powerful speaker. He spoke with a great intensity and emotion and a lot of self-deprecating humor. He had a deep, resonant voice, and you could sense a fire, a passion within that burned as a result of all the suffering that he had been through. And this suffering he had transmuted and transformed into the most intimate sense and infinite sense of meaning and purpose and the need to share with others in the simplest but most powerful ways of how to find meaning in any interior or external circumstance in your life. Even when you had nothing, as he had nothing during those 4 years in the concentration camps, one can still find bliss and life when one feels love. And this was his message. Although he didn't often talk about love, it was the power behind his own personal life. He always asked people to look for the deeper meaning in their own life, whether they were atheists or whether they were religious people or whether they were spiritual people, 3 different categories of people. It didn't matter. One can always find meaning in one's life. And obviously, in our world where other people, or most of us, try to find meaning through money or job or looks or clothes or cars or homes or whatever it may be, meaning can only come through some interior search for the higher purpose of your own why and who am I and why am I here and what can I do with my life that would be the highest meaningful purpose for myself and give me the greatest byproduct of fulfillment and happiness, which only come when you're living your own meaning. As I said, Dr. Viktor Frankl, I used to sit on the stage. He had a series of talks at Massey Hall in Toronto in the late 60s and early 70s. Toronto was his one favorite place in Canada where he taught, although he did teach a lot in America, including Chicago and in Texas. And he used to just talk about the higher purpose of your life, notwithstanding the fact that even as a young person, you wonder what you can make of your life, what you can do of your life, how to make a living and what profession to be in and so on, and which direction to go in your life. He always used to suggest that there was something that you could find in your present circumstances that could give you keys or clues to the meaning and purpose of your life. And you had to follow these like a path of breadcrumbs through the forest. And that when you did, it would lead you inexorably, day by day, week by week, year by year, to that higher meaning and purpose in your life. And it all had to do with being honest about your existential reality, being honest about your vulnerability, your feelings, your emotions, your anxieties in particular, and how to work through those in your own terms in order to conquer your fears and to conquer your anxieties, one after another, to take one fear, take one anxiety, and work on it, acknowledge it, paradoxically even move towards it rather than away from it, move into the fear, into the anxiety, and see where it would take you. This so profoundly moved me as a young man that I eventually set up a whole series of workshops that went on for years to support people working through the process of transforming all of their anxieties and fears, not to mention their sadnesses and griefs and their angers and their shames and embarrassments. This process work of humanistic endeavor on yourself is actually the key to finding the meaning in your own life. Now, another thing that Dr. Frankl spoke about quite a lot, and there's a very moving video of him speaking in 1993, a few years before he passed over, at the Holocaust Memorial Service in Vienna, Austria, which was attended by thousands of people in an open-air forum. And in this very exciting and moving, in fact, bone-chilling speech that he made at a lectern over the crowd, he talks about two kinds of races or two kinds of human beings in the world: the decent people and the indecent people. And by the indecent or undecent people, he meant the people that have no principles. And he said this, that the decent people have always been and will always be the minority in the world. And for some reason, the indecent people, the negative people, the people who have no principles, rise to the top of positions of power in government and in society and in business and in the military. And that we must watch out for this and be aware of it and do something about it, because there's only these two races in all the peoples of the world. It crosses all the boundaries of nations and ethnic groups and religious groups and ages. And these two races have always been at odds with one another as to who and which ethics will rule societies and the future of all peoples. He said in 1993 in this address to the world that the Holocaust could happen again in any nation at any time and in any region, in any group, and that we all had to be aware and awake to this fact. The only way that it might be possible to avoid it is if we all became decent people and moved out of the meaninglessness in our lives and created some love in our life and some self-responsibility in our life. He said this, it's not enough to have freedom. Freedom is only half of what we're looking for. The other half of freedom is self-responsibility. And unless and until every person and nations take self-responsibility for their own thoughts, words, values, and actions, then only will everyone have freedom. And it is an individual path. When groups of people have become such loving, open, meaning-filled people, then the world can be a better place. What I'd like to say in closing is that, the previous video to this one was about modern man or humans' search for meaning, and Dr. Viktor Frankl showed in his personal life and in his teachings and his logotherapy that it is possible to find meaning, ultimate meaning, even happiness and joy. He was a man of great laughter and wit and intellect. He loved being with people and meeting with people. He supported a lot of people who went through deep challenges, in many cases of people who had been severely abused or had physical ailments and were paraplegics, quadriplegics. And he showed that in any circumstances, particularly people with cancer, that you can find the meaning and even the deeper experience of purpose in any illness or any health issue you have, whether it's a mental illness, an emotional challenge, or physical illness. And a lot of this in his own personal life, although he never spoke of it, was his deep relationship to the source. Very prayerful man. Nevertheless, he maintains that his logotherapy is for every person. An atheist psychotherapist or psychiatrist could do just as well with their clients, and if they had atheistic clients, as any person who had some other kind of spiritual experience in their own life. These principles of the overwhelming power of love carry forward in every circumstance with every person on the planet. I'm sure Dr. Frankl's wish for you, wherever you may be, is that you experience meaning and purpose and love in whatever tragedy you are in now, and yourself, you will turn that tragedy into a triumph. Dr. Joseph Martin, all love and blessings.